Listen, there's not a lot of bands that stick it out through multiple decades and just ride that baby out and stay together for a long, long time. There are bands that have done it through lineup changes, but most of the time, they don't stick it out. Maybe it's because they retire, or multiple deaths in the band, or maybe it's because there's drug issues, there's lots of problems between band members, music producers, and record labels getting involved where the bands just say, screw this, too much pressure, too much crap, I'm done. Whatever it is, whether it's on your terms or not, eventually it's going to be a day where it comes a time that it's done, it's over with. Now, there's a band that I'm thinking of right now that has just eclipsed the 40-year mark of being a band. That's the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Now, the band that exists today, this lineup, to me, this is the lineup that's going to come to most people's minds when you ask somebody, who are the members of the Red Hot Chili Peppers? I'm going to say Flea, Anthony Kiedis, Chad Smith, John Frusciante. Those are the guys that I think are the Red Hot Chili Peppers, regardless if that was the original lineup or not. We know Flea and Anthony were there from the beginning. We know Chad and John came later, but it wasn't much later. But when you say, who are the Red Hot Chili Peppers? Those guys are the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So the actual formation of the Red Hot Chili Peppers was in 1982. All four guys went to Fairfax High School in Los Angeles, California. You had Flea and Anthony Kiedis, a man by the name of Hillel Slovak. He played guitar. A man by the name of Jack Irons. He was on drums. Those were the four original members of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. They actually dropped their first original debut album, 1984, self-titled album, and they got radio play, and mostly college radio. MTV actually picked them up and promoted them a little bit and started to build them a little fan base. This album, for a debut album, wasn't too bad because it sold a little over 300,000 copies. So 1985 saw them drop their second album, Freaky Styley. They brought a guy named George Clinton in. He was a funk musician, so he brought that funk sound. They had a lot of different sounds in this album, a little punk sound, little funk, different instruments. And this sound actually fit the Chili Peppers for this album. And they actually would continue to use it in later albums, and it fit them even better. But by then, in their later albums, they started to master their instruments, master music altogether. So it sounded better later, but it still fit for this album. Now their third album, the Uplift Mofo Party Plan, this album was originally going to be produced by the legendary Rick Rubin. Now he declined. He didn't want the project. He didn't want nothing to do with it. Reason being, at this time, Slovak, especially, and Kiedis were bad on the drugs. Cocaine and heroin, mostly heroin. And Rick Rubin didn't want nothing to do with that. They eventually brought another guy in. He produced the album. It actually hit. It got on the Billboard 200 charts, and it did pretty well. But this is when the band started to dip into one of their bad moments. So after the Chili Peppers dropped their third album, the Uplift Mofo Party Plan, they went on tour to promote it. They went on tour with the band Faith No More, who is a band I think we might get into another time. But they were also promoting a new album. So the bands were touring, and Kiedis and Slovak, they were not slowing down on their addiction. They were full speed ahead. They were going all in. They were disappearing for days on end sometimes, but they would show up to play when needed. Now, not long after the tour ended, June 25th, 1988, Slovak died from a heroin overdose. Now, I'm telling you right now, anybody out there, and we'll get into it another time, but I'm not saying this out of ignorance. If you stick a needle in your arm or you stick something up your nose or anything, you're rolling the dice, because once it's in there, it's all up to God after that. If you overdid it, you might be done. And unfortunately for Slovak, he was. And this freak Kiedis out. He ended up leaving town. He was nowhere to be found for a while. He was gone. He was off the grid. And then Jack Irons, he couldn't deal with it. He quit the band. Now later on, Jack Irons didn't do too bad for himself. He's still a drummer. And in 1994, he joined the band Pearl Jam. And he jammed with them from 94 all the way to 1998. So not too bad for him there. So Kiedis ended up entering a rehabilitation center. And while he was there, apparently, they had him go visit Slovak's grave. This was supposed to be part of him, you know, confronting his grief, his emotional pain. So they had him do that. I find it odd, but at the same time, I don't. So then they brought in some new members to fill in those voids. They brought in a guy named Blackbird McKnight on guitar. He was a guitarist for some other bands before. And then they brought in D.H. Peligro. He was the drummer for the Dead Kennedys. They brought him in on drums. It didn't take too long after rehearsing and practicing together that they realized they just weren't getting no chemistry with McKnight, and they let him go. And then it was one night, D.H. brought up a young teenage fan to meet Kiedis and Flea, a guy by the name of John Frusciante. He ended up joining the band on guitar, and he played his first show with the Chili Peppers in September of 1988. So once again, drugs and alcohol reared its ugly face. They ended up getting rid of their drummer DH at the time because of his substance abuse issues. It just was not working out. He was out. Then they immediately started auditioning for new drummers. There was a guy that showed up by the name of Chad Smith, and they said when they started jamming with him, they knew instantly that was their guy. And ever since that day, Chad Smith has been the drummer for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So the guys immediately got in the studio to work on their fourth album, Mother's Milk, which was released in 1989. Now this ended up climbing the charts all over the world. Hits like Knock Me Down and then their cover of Higher Ground. This ended up getting certified gold. Sold over 500,000 copies, and it was a huge success. So 1990, after the success of Mother's Milk, there ended up being a bidding war over signing the band. These major labels were fighting over signing them. Could you imagine how good that had to feel to these guys? Could you imagine? You know that you're going in the right direction when that's happening. I mean, I want you, no, I want you, You got to be just standing there like, this is awesome. Ultimately, they ended up signing with Warner Brothers Records. Warner Brothers wanted to bring in Rick Rubin so they could go in and start working on their fifth studio album. Now, you remember what happened in 1987. Rick didn't want nothing to do with the band. The guys were way strung out on drugs. They just were young, stupid, and he said, nah, I'm out on that. But he was more willing to work with them this time. And he even said they just looked healthier. They looked more sharp. They were focused, like they were ready to work and do things the right way. They wanted to succeed. He was willing to work with them. This wouldn't end up being the last time he'd work with them either. Now, they got in the studio to work on their fifth album, Blood, Sugar, Sex, Magic. Now, this album, when it came out, their first two singles are two of their biggest hits ever. Their first single, you know, give it away, give it away, give it away now. Give it away, give it away, give it away now. You know it, right? Immediately, if it comes on, you know it. And then their second single, Under the Bridge Downtown is where I drew some blood. Huge hit. Two of their biggest hits and most recognizable songs. If it plays on the radio, you know it. Now this ended up selling over 12 million copies. Reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. They were trending in the right direction. So even with the success of Blood, Sugar, Sex, Magic, Frusciante had a growing heroin addiction and was not getting along with Kiedis. And he ultimately, in 1992, after a show in Tokyo, quit the band, flew back to LA to just be in his addiction. Now, they ended up bringing in Dave Navarro, the guitarist for Jane's Addiction. He had just split with the band because of, well, similar issues. His drug addiction and his problems. But they brought him on, and he was in the studio when they recorded their 6th studio album, One Hot Minute, which dropped in 1995. Now, during the tour to promote this album, it was full of disastrous events. So many things happened that were just, it was horrible. And he stuck around till 1998, and ultimately he ended up leaving the band because of creative differences. So the Red Hot Chili Peppers were literally on the verge of breaking up in 1998. Flea ended up finding John Frusciante and begged him to go into a rehabilitation center, and he eventually convinced him. And one day he was up there to visit John, and he asked him, will you please come back and join the band? And they say John broke out, started bawling, crying, and said there was nothing in the world that would make him happier. And he was back. But I mean, I tell you, when he entered this rehabilitation center, he was horrible. Track marks, he had oral issues, nose issues, he had a lot of problems. So I think Flea going to him was probably a saving grace for him at that time. So they got in the studio. After a year of production, they dropped their 7th studio album, Californication. This album sold 16 million copies, one of their best-selling albums of all time. Matter of fact, I think it might be their best-selling album of all time. Fact check me on that. If I'm wrong, drop it in the comment section, but I believe it is. Now, this dropped 3 #1 hits, 3 #1 rock hits, 3 of the greatest hits in rock history. I love the Red Hot Chili Peppers. A lot of people don't put them up there as one of the greatest, but in my heart, they're up there. Scar Tissue. Man, one of the greatest songs. I mean, it really dives deep into Anthony Kiedis' drug addiction. Great, great song. Californication, another one. Huge hit, awesome song. And then Other Side, another hit. Classic. Great song. I could listen to all three of them. I could listen to that whole album. I remember the first time the album dropped. My stepdad went and bought it. I heard it. Freaking fell in love with it. It was a masterpiece. And then critics said this album wouldn't have been what it was without John Frusciante being back and playing on it. And they said Anthony Kiedis' vocals at this time had just grown so great that it made the album as great as it was. Californication, classic. So the next two albums by the Chili Peppers were just two more masterpieces. 2002, you had By the Way. Had the title track By the Way. The Zephyr song, Can't Stop. All hits. Great album. I remember the music video, By the Way. It was so cool that the dude was just riding around picking up all the members of the bands and freaking driving them crazy, trying to kidnap them. Cool video. And then in 2006, they released their 2-disc set, Stadium Arcadium. I remember this album because I was just a year out of high school. And I bought this album and back and forth to work for months. I would listen to this whole album. I'd listen to the first disc. When it was done, I'd throw the second disc in until I was burned out on it pretty much. Tons of hits on there. Danny California, Snow, tons of hits. It was a good album. Now, in between those two albums, in 2003, they dropped a Greatest Hits album and had two new songs on there, Save the Population, and sometimes I kind of think this is my favorite Chili Pepper song, Fortune Faded. I remember I heard that song. I burnt the disc in high school, and I had that song on there because I heard it on the radio. And I just love the way the guitar is at the beginning and the whole melody through the song. And then obviously Kiedis' voice is awesome. So 2009 rolls around. John Frusciante leaves the band once more, and they ended up bringing in a guy. His name was Josh Klinghoffer to play guitar. And they took Josh into the studio, and he was with them when they started working on their 10th studio album, I'm With You. Now this album had some good songs on it, and you really hardly notice a big difference in the guitar, but you know John's guitar compared to anybody's else. But it was a pretty good album altogether. No complaints from me, but still, I'd rather have John on guitar. Alright, so 2014. 2014 rolls around, the guys get back in the studio to work on their 11th studio album. Now this was going to be the first album since 1989 that Rick Rubin would not produce for the Chili Peppers. So 2016 they released it. It was called The Getaway. Now that's me personally. If you know the album, then you probably have your own opinion. If you've never heard the album, go listen to it. This is my least favorite Red Hot Chili Peppers album. And that's not saying it's a bad one. Just personally, for me, it's my least favorite. So they toured around for the next 3 years. They promoted that album in the first year and a half. They were playing, selling out stadiums like they always do, just rocking out. In 2019, the Chili Peppers, Josh Klinghoffer, they went their separate ways. He left the band. It wasn't a bad split. It was nothing nasty. There was no animosity. It wasn't nothing like that. But he left the band. And then John Frusciante was back, baby. He was back. The man you want to see on guitar for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He came back. The guys were back together again. And then in February of 2020, he played his first show back with the Chili Peppers in 13 years. So last year in 2022, the Chili Peppers released 2 albums in 1 year. They released Unlimited Love earlier in the year, and this was their first album to hit #1 since Stadium Arcadium in 2006. And then later in the year, they released their album Return of the Dream Canteen. Now, think about this. John Frusciante was back. His last album he did with them, Stadium Arcadium. Guess who else was back? That's right, Rick Rubin was back. You bring Rick back, you bring John back, you get a #1 album. Who'd have guessed it? Please do me a favor. If you like what I had to say so far, please like and subscribe to the channel. That will help me grow, and that will put me out there to a bigger audience, and I can share this with more people. Anything I have to say, I can share it with a larger audience, which is what I want to do. Now we got to ask, what's the Red Hot Chili Peppers legacy? Well, for one, it's not done being written yet. They're still rocking out. The guys are getting older, but the music's still awesome. I gotta say, every decade since 1990, we've had amazing hits by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. How can you not say that's not a great band that's done great things, and they're still continuing to do it? And they're so iconic. Everybody knows Flea. The bassist with one name, Flea. And there's a couple other ones out there, but Flea is iconic. You know him, you know his style, you just know it. And then Anthony Kiedis, you know him because he's freaking amazing. He's awesome. The way he can sing, the way he can go into like a rap mode, everything he does is awesome. The whole lineup, Chad Smith on the drums, John on guitar. The band is awesome. I don't care if anybody says they're not. You're full of crap. But I love the Red Hot Chili Peppers. You love the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And they will go, when it's all said and done, and they wrap it up, they'll go down as one of the greatest bands in rock history. So one more time, please like, please subscribe, help this channel grow, help me grow, and let's get out there and tell more stories about these people that started from humble beginnings, just like you and I, and turned out to be stars. American Dream Channel. Thank you. Until next time, take care. I'm out.